Welcome to Beyond the Fine Print, the podcast where we help you simplify the ever-evolving world of commercial laws and technology and answer the major questions facing lawyers today. I'm your host, Rory O'Keefe, and in each episode, we'll be breaking through the jargon so you can stay ahead, keep it cool, and take control back. Now let's get started. Welcome everybody to Beyond the Fine Print. Today we're talking about all things quantum computing. Now if you've pictured a laptop wearing a cape solving crimes in the multiverse, you're not alone. Today's guest here is to bring us back to Earth and then launch us into orbit again with some legal citations, no doubt. We are very pleased and honoured to have Rebecca Keating on our podcast today. She is a barrister at Four Pump Court, ranked by Legal 500 as a rising star in IT, telecoms and financial services. She's co-author of the book, The Law of Quantum Computing with Laura Wright. Shout out to you, Laura. She's also contributed to the book, The Law of Artificial Intelligence, and a member of the ICO's Technology Advisory Panel. Whew. So basically, if quantum law had Justice League, she'd be on it. So let's get into this. Hello, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks for the fab introduction. Nice. Yeah, I feel like almost a superhero. I think it's the closest I'm probably ever going to get from that introduction. But I will take it. I will take it.
So let's just jump straight into the whole concept of quantum computing. I'm always impressed with people who are futurists, strategists, and yourself and Laura sat down and wrote a book which for lawyers is a logical read because it's step by step. For anybody who's not not a lawyer, you can still digest this book, which I really, really enjoy. Let's go back a little bit for what quantum ground zero. What is a qubit? And why do quantum physicists get this slightly suspicious sparkle in their eye whenever they talk about them?
Quantum computing, I agree, can sound quite kind of futuristic. But really what it is, it's a new type of computer. So like all things, I always think it's good to start off with something we all know pretty well. And hopefully everyone who's listening knows, or at least uses, I'd say day to day, a computer. But what's different about a quantum computer, and I suppose why those physicists are getting that little sparkle in their eye that you've mentioned, Rory, is that they approach computation in a different way. And because the quantum computers do that, it means they have different benefits, which we can capitalize on. So in short, what they do is they capitalize on the kind of special properties of quantum physics to carry out computations in a different way. So if you think about your normal computer that uses bits, which are binary digits, zeros and ones, to do these big lines of code, and then everything we do from that is kind of built on those lines of code. Whereas quantum computers have a different fundamental unit, which are called qubits, which obviously you've mentioned. And what those are essentially are actually like photons that we, as an example, manipulate to carry out computational calculations in a different way. So I think obviously that's the starting point. I think what's unfortunate about learning about quantum computing for the first time is actually that is one of the more difficult things to get your head around, that it's so fundamentally different. But if you think about the output, in some ways is quite similar. Like what people will want to use it for are essentially calculations, but how it gets to that point is quite different.
That's very interesting. So my pause was only because I had in the back of my mind that quantum computers will basically be MacBooks that have drank some kind of protein shake and started doing CrossFit and then end up calculating something so quickly that you couldn't keep up and then suddenly having an existential crisis in the process. It's a lot closer than we think because I was minded before this podcast was to think about the comparators with other kind of evolving technologies or new technologies. And one was many years ago, we used to talk about the metaverse. Not so much right now. But that did cause lawyers to start thinking outside the box, which is where you're at with quantum computing. The purpose of your book and everything else that you're doing, besides this, you're a barrister doing tech disputes and everything else needed around all things tech. But it is demanding you to kind of say, well, where could this go? And I suppose going from a big global level, like in geopolitics, like honestly, it'd be great if I don't have to reboot my computer every time the webcam dies or has some kind of hissy fit. So I am welcoming the quantum overlords if that's what's going to happen here. But what I'm trying to work at is that there is a equivalent of a space race here for quantum computing. So you've mentioned in your book around Google, IBM, and countries like China. And I'm sure there's somebody on Reddit who claims to be, hey, he's already built some kind of quantum computer out of a toaster and sheer optimism. But what do you see, like who's out there, who's investing, where are we going with this on a global scale?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Rory. So I'd say going back to what a quantum computer is and what it can do is anything that's very data rich, that's where a quantum computer is really going to thrive. So Rory, when you're talking about your computer running a bit slow or things like that, unfortunately, the quantum overlords probably won't save us on that. But what quantum computers will do, and where I think companies and countries see potential, are where you have large and vast amounts of data and you need to process and ask it a question and get an answer. But also areas like science, where actually classic computers, by that I mean normal computers, aren't very well suited. So I think that's an important context to look at why different companies are investing money in this and why different countries are investing money. So you're right. So when you think about the space race, the equivalent we have in quantum computing is what people call the race for quantum supremacy or quantum advantage. And you can have lots of fights about what that means and what the significance is. But in short, what I see that is essentially a race for a quantum computer to do a task, a useful task, so something we actually want an answer from, in an amount of time that a classic computer just either wouldn't ever be able to do or wouldn't be able to do in a useful amount of time. So like you might have to wait weeks for an answer, where a quantum computer might give you an answer in a couple of hours. And when you look at like this race for quantum supremacy, and you mentioned Google, IBM, there's some really big players. They are more interested in the utility of quantum computing when it comes to things like, companies that are involved in financial services, let's say, for example, modeling a financial market. That's something where quantum computing could be very useful. You've got a lot of data, you need quick answers. And also things like pharmaceuticals and medicine. So trying to figure out what drugs might work, where, we just wouldn't have the time to go through all the data. A quantum computer can really supercharge that. And also is very good at mimicking the natural world because it itself is quantum physics, essentially. So it's closer to the natural world. But when you mention things like countries, why are countries investing? When you see things like IBM and Google investing, that's really to do with defense and to do with kind of cyber defense and things like that, which we can go into in more detail. And you mentioned China. They're actually very advanced in terms of things like quantum networks, but also the UK is investing a lot of money as well. And the objective, obviously, is to be a leader in quantum computing as well. So it's quite an interesting landscape. If you asked who's winning, I don't know if it's easy to answer that question now, but certainly a lot of people are at the start line and already along the track in the race. We just don't know who's going to get to the finish line first.
Interesting. I was kind of just minded because one of the examples that I've read about is in kind of genetics, because the complexities around the amount of computer power in order to review such vast knowledge. It seems like a natural fit to use quantum computers to look through that. And so you can see the real benefits. If we can make this happen, you can see the benefits. And I'm sure everybody listening can also see a lot of the issues that can arise as lawyers. We trying to work out which one do we need to tell the CEO about first. But talking about that, actually, it's kind of interesting. I was looking at what stuff that would make government agencies sweat. And in some ways, it's like somebody had said something and I read, and they said, imagine a customs officer trying to confiscate quantum code. And they'd ask us saying, do you have anything to declare? And said, just a probability wave. And you're going, oh. It's kind of,
yeah, I know.
So their jokes are coming. It's just, there's layers to it.
Yes. Like all jokes, you need to feel smart, Rory? So just giving that nugget.
That's not me. That's why I have you here. And that's why we all want to hear from you, not from me. What I was curious about was I thought that, with some evolving technologies or certain new technologies, we don't have a legal basis to start from. We're making it up, or we will draw from the past to inform the future, like we did with artificial intelligence, even though it's been around since the 1950s. But one thing in your book, which I didn't know even existed, and this is, I don't know if it's a reflection on me and everybody else will say, yes, we know it before. It's the National Security Investment Act. And we've got even considerations in your book around that, plus export controls and algorithms, encryption, because encryption, and you said security, but encryption could actually become obsolete in some respects once you introduce quantum computing. So there is attempts at some, even at national level, to keep pace of some way with quantum. And we're still not sure who's driving the bus here on this. So if we were to look at this on regulation, a lot of you would say, oh, we've already had this on the artificial intelligence piece. And it's not done, by the way, especially from a UK standpoint. We're still not done on regulation. But how do you regulate something that's literally can't be touched? So you can't exactly squeeze a Quibbit at Heathrow Airport. So what are your thoughts about where we might be going on regulation?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, Rory. And as you say, it's kind of one that comes up with any kind of new or emergent technology, like how do we apply old principles to this new technology, which the law, as you say, can do pretty well sometimes. But also there's new or novel questions that we need to think about. And I think you're right that the National Security and Investment Act 2021 is a good example of that. So for those who are listening who haven't come across it before, essentially in the UK, it grants the Secretary of State powers to scrutinise and intervene in certain acquisitions to kind of safeguard the UK's national security. And it covers a range of transactions, and it includes not only M&A, but also minority investments, acquiring voting rights and IP. And quantum technologies come within this mandatory notification regime. So essentially that means where there's an acquisition of a certain kind, which is set out in the Act, essentially the UK government has to be notified that this acquisition, for example, is taking place, and the UK government can intervene and they can put different controls in place for the deal to happen. So something might be you need to have a CTO that's based in the UK, for example, or, there are different conditions and they can be quite innovative about that. But as you say, really at the heart of that, I think, is this concern about what quantum technologies, and that includes more than quantum computers, so like quantum sensors, lasers, what they can be used for, which wouldn't be within the UK's national interests. And you've obviously mentioned stuff to do with cybersecurity, for example. And so that's one example. I think if anyone was listening to this and they work in-house, I think that's something just to have on your radar, because you're certainly not alone in not knowing about this. I would say most people I meet who are even really interested in this can sometimes be surprised to hear that there is actually legislation in the UK which touches upon this new technology. In terms of where we're going, I think AI is an interesting blueprint for that. Obviously at EU level, we have the EU AI Act. And there was mention last year at a European Commission meeting, there might be a Quantum Act. Now, obviously, someone like me who loves this kind of rubs their hands together and thinks, oh my God, this is very exciting. I think that's very much, it was a comment. I think people won't see something like this happening for years and years. But I think what that shows is there's definitely this appetite to probably use some of the lessons we've learned in the context of AI and apply it to quantum technologies. And so I think in a few years, if we're chatting about this, I think we probably could even have a conversation about the parallels and how we've differed in that approach. So I'd say, the two main takeaways are there is actually law to do with this, which can surprise people. And two, I'd say there's more coming, but we'll just need to see what that is.
Well, we can only hope that the result from an EU level or a UK level won't be as, what's the nice word? I can only say it, torturous as the EU AI Act.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say chaotic, but yeah.
Chaotic. Everybody's got their own thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Because I'm also minded by, the Draghi report on competitiveness that was launched last year, which just shows how the vast array of technical, digital legislation, from a cybersecurity to infrastructure, NIST, DORA, all of those. And when you pull together all the regulatory agencies and all the different European states, and then you translate the extraterritorial effect that impacts the UK where we are and who we support, it's like an extra piece of legislation which, for us lawyers working in-house to advise, we spend our time saying, it's going to be a high, it's a middle, it's a top, middle or bottom risk profile, or is it a red, gold, amber? What do we want to call it? But ultimately, I think it comes down to the technology itself and how do we describe and understand it, and how do we create legislation that is living and evolving, which is tricky to do, which we've seen under the EU AI Act. It's tricky to try and find, like the last few months of just the final drafting of the Act saw changes, which, because the world had changed, they were trying to adjust the change in the last few weeks, if I can say. Anyway, leaving that aside, you did point to what I call a bit of control paranoia, which is around cybercrime and privacy. So when at various conferences that we all go to, we talk a lot about cybersecurity. We talk about data, protecting data. I think data became even a bigger conversation when ChatGPT first launched. You know, the Italian Data Protection Authority paused it for a number of months before it could confirm where it's at. I think there's similar overtures on DeepSeek, which is the follow-on equivalent of it. So you can see how they want to go further in relation to, but they're not too sure how. And we all know about privacy design by default. Now you've got security by design by default, and you've got an array of different competing interests around where we should go in the cybersecurity. The short of it is, as AI has made things more, and the attacks that can be conducted more sophisticated by using these new tools, which are benefiting all legal practices, but at the same time, they're also benefiting the hackers. And so it makes hackers today look like charming amateurs from the early 2000s. So if encryption can be broken, what happens to GDPR? What happens to banking security, passwords, private health data? It's like our entire digital house of cards are potentially at risk by the introduction of this technology. So what are your thoughts around this and the preparedness that governments and other interested parties are around this? It just seems like it has the potential to unravel a lot of really good work that's been put in place over many years now.
Yeah, so it's a good point, Rory. And I think for people who are listening who might have encountered quantum computing before, this is going to be the topic that they've probably heard about. And that there's this potential to upend our current cryptography system and have very negative effects. I would say on a positive note, before I start explaining the negatives of that, it has both the potential to build very secure networks that we've never had before built on quantum cryptography itself. But as you say, Rory, also the potential to upend current encryption methods that underpin our current security systems. And just to give people listening the context of what that risk is, you know, Deloitte did a really interesting report last year on predictions on quantum computers and the impact it would have. And the estimate was that it would take about 8 hours to break an RSA key. And some calculations predict that a Bitcoin signature could be hacked within 30 minutes. So obviously, you know, we can't live in those kind of timescales. You know, we can't be changing our passwords every 5 hours on the basis that...
Please no.
Yeah. I mean, most people barely remember to do it every few months when they're prompted by their, you know, maybe their IT team.
But not us. But not us. Okay. Just in case anybody's
safe,
listening.
Yeah. We're super secure, but others may not do that. So that obviously won't work. And I think there's two risks of that. I think there's actually an immediate risk that people are not as aware of, which is what they call harvest now, decrypt later strategies, which is where these third parties are collecting data, which they can't currently do anything useful with. But on the basis that maybe, 5-10 years time, and we don't need to get into exact estimates, they will be able to get into that information. And so that's, I think, a message as to why people really need to think about their current encryption standards and just making sure that they are up to scratch so that that data is protected. But obviously, Rory, it's the longer term risk that essentially, our data will be accessed. But I think there are some quite good, what they call them, quantum readiness plans. So, the National Institute in the UK, and there's different global ones as well, have set out guidance about how organizations can prepare for quantum readiness. A lot of that, to be honest, at the moment is just having, larger numbers to factor. So that, you just have more complicated passwords in essence. I think in the longer term, I think what we might see is almost like a bit of a two-tier protection of data, which is that government data, maybe very sensitive medical information, things like that will be protected by these quantum secure networks. And then data, which is, a little bit less important, for example, like my cinema history, for example, if someone wants to log in and see that, might have an enhanced RSA method, essentially. So I think, Rory, there are definitely methods where hopefully this shouldn't be a problem. But I think where's going to be the difficulty is who's going to get there first with using this technology and how prepared are we for that? There are certainly discussions around it, but there probably could be a little bit more awareness, certainly now that people are harvesting information.
So listening to that, what came to me was interesting or not, actually, it's for everybody else to decide. But for me, it's around when we say preparedness for something, it's a question of what the technology is. So if we leave it, it's that classic, do we wait to see what the market brings and then regulate based on what we're seeing after we've done it? But with quantum computing, it feels like that's too much of a risk. You need to have, it's a bit like drugs trials. You need to first go through all the testing before you can release it to the market and get all the yeses from the relevant parties, the regulators, the government agencies, whoever is in play before you can go to market, because of that, it's possibly too late if they go straight to market without those controls in place. Which for some people, they'll say, oh, but then nothing will get to market. Because then it'll be just red tape after red tape. I don't know what the answers to that, but what would your view be on that?
Yeah, so I think are you kind of saying like organizations who might be designing their own kind of quantum computing
Let's say we mentioned Google and IBM. No,
Yeah.
like anybody from Google and IBM, this is not an attack or anything. That is just, and for anybody else who's doing it, sorry, write in, let me know, and I'll give you a shout out the next one we can. But the idea is that so they create something that they want to commoditize. Should that go through some sort of quality checks before, and quality checks independent from them, by some agency, some regulator, something that can then answer the question, of trust that all citizens want. Because that's ultimately the whole purpose of any technologies. You must have trust in it, or it won't sell. But if you've got quantum computer going out, which potentially could decrypt, even your best password that you can come up with, and your multi-factor authentication and everything else you've been told to do under ISO 27001 and everything else that's out there. Or for those who are still on Cyber Essentials Plus, that's all valid too. It all works. But the reality is that is it too much of a risk to allow something onto the market and then regulate after?
Yeah. So it's a really good question, Rory. So obviously there are, as we've discussed briefly, some current regimes to try deal with this. So you've got, the National Security Act, and you've also got things like, dual use export controls. So thinking about technologies and have dual uses, that's been something that people have had to think about for a while. I think on your question, though, the interesting point, which I think is true, is that at the moment, the way those regimes define quantum technologies, I think, is overly broad. And I think it would capture, as you say, potentially quite useful uses of quantum technologies, which, to be honest, I think the risk of there being this dual use, for example, the hacking risk, is actually quite low. And if you look at something like the National Security Investment Act and you look at the schedules, there's obviously the quantum technology schedule, which I've mentioned. But I think it's actually interesting to look, there's an AI section in that act as well. But it's much more narrowly defined what those use cases of AI are. And I think that's a good example, Rory, of the point you were getting at there, which I think we probably, I say we, the government, lawmakers.
It's just you. That's all. You're the expert.
just me on my own.
What does Rebecca think? And we'll all follow.
I think there probably needs some thought given to what actually is the real technical risk, rather than just kind of a blunt reference to quantum technologies. Because I think you're right, Rory. We don't want to miss out on what are, I think, some of the really exciting use cases, and where we might get to just by being a little bit, maybe I'd say, overly cautious about this risk, which is a real risk, but there's a balance to get there, which we haven't.
Balance. Famous word. Let's find the
famous
balance.
lawyer's word. Yeah.
Yes. Well, even talking about balance, was the phrase we always use, balancing the risk and the reward, leads me into my next topic, which is around contracts. Because we've talked about contracts, IP, ESG, especially in the area of LLMs. So it's a common topic you see everywhere now, everybody talking about it. But if I'm sitting down to negotiate a deal involving some form of quantum infrastructure or software or computing power or algorithm, whatever it may be, what should be on the checklist that most lawyers haven't even considered yet?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously all the very basic things, which we don't need to talk about, but I'd say getting the basics right is obviously the first thing. But once you've ticked that off the list and you've thought about all of that, I think it's looking about how you might define terms in that contract and thinking about how those definitions are going to align with, your commercial objectives, let's say. And there are some quite useful defined terms. So, the National Institute, for example, have some good examples of defined terms that parties can look at. And in the book, we list some examples of different organizations that have set out defined terms, which are worth looking at. Obviously, by the time people listen to this podcast, there might be more useful frameworks to look at. But, the National Quantum Computing Centre in the UK have a list of defined terms. The National Institute also have a list. And even the ISO also sometimes have some lists as well. But I think looking at those, not to copy them because they might not suit in your individual case, but just as a starting point for thinking about this technology and how you might be defining terms in it. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing is just thinking about how you define success for your contract. And that obviously applies in any contract, and in particular in IT contracts, but certainly with quantum. Because if you think about it, going back to what a quantum computer is, it's essentially a machine that expresses the probability, the negative probability of something happening or not happening. And that itself isn't the way that people normally think about expressing success. So if, for example, you want to say there should be an X probability of Y happening, and we want the machine to be right 95% of the time, you're going to have to think about how you want to express that. So yeah, I would say thinking about defined terms and thinking about how you define success will be increasingly important if you're contracting for quantum computing.
Okay. There's good practical examples there, which is useful, but I think the defining success, that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
But that's exciting as well to try and get your teeth into something like that. That's good. I did mention ESG, and I mention it more so now because with the various LLM models out there, the ChatGPTs, Copilot, Gemini, there's loads more. Sorry for not naming you all. But the reality of it is that each prompt, each answer is driving an energy drain. It's also impacting water, as we've heard many reports of how much water is used in order to answer the questions. And nearly every law firm, every in-house team now has some form of an AI tool that's attached on to help them with their day-to-day job. So that, and when you transfer that into a quantum tech, the concern obviously for a lot of people would be that, is there an environmental angle to this that we need to consider? Or is it just that we're giving a lab equipment a sustainability badge and just hoping for the best? Because like somebody had said to me before this, I like the idea. It said, if a quantum computer writes a novel, does it get a book deal, or is it just a cease and desist from ChatGPT? Which I think is actually more to do with the IP question than the actual ESG question. But I'm just curious, pointing on the ESG, where do you think, is there something that we need to consider? You're not obviously developing the technology, so you can't tell us everything. Unless you can.
I love the vote of confidence, Rory. But I think you're right. So in answer to your question, yes, there are ESG points that you would need to be thinking about. I think a point we haven't really got to talk about in the podcast so far, but is useful certainly in this topic, is to think about what a quantum computer looks like. How does it work? Okay. And, why is it so powerful? If you take Tianyi-2, which is, one of the most powerful classical computers on the planet, okay, it costs $400 million to run a year. It burns about 20 megawatts of electricity. That's enough to power 20,000 homes, and has 3.2 million Intel cores, okay? It's a big machine, okay? In comparison, a single chip with about 50 to 80 qubits on it would be more powerful than the entire Tianyi-2, which, as we discussed, it's the size of half a football field. So when you think about that, you might think, oh, well, that sounds great. We've got this 50, 60 qubit chip versus this huge, hungry computer. That must be better for the environment. But what people kind of forget is that chip sits itself in a huge machine, which has to be, depending on the method, cooled to sub-zero degrees, and can be, people call it a diva of the computer world. And what that means, essentially, you need fans, you need, cold temperatures, no kind of ground movement, anything like that. And that results in a lot of, potentially a huge environmental impact. So I think for organizations in due course that are using quantum computing, they'll probably be accessing it via cloud. So it's not going to be like on premises, but obviously they will still have this environmental impact. And as you say, it's a little bit like AI. Is it enough that this organization says, we have no negative carbon output and we give you a certificate? Is that good enough for you? It's probably here, I'd say just a very acute risk because people won't understand how the technology works. But I think the headline point is, while they might sound like small machines because of the size of the useful part of the machine, to get to that, there's going to be a huge energy impact. We can obviously have much more exciting discussions about, the trade-off, like will we get useful answers? Could we get some answers to some of our difficulties with climate change, for example, by running research on these machines? But just on the pure output, that's certainly going to be something that people are going to have to think about.
That's interesting. I'm sorry, but I have Diva computers now burned into my head with these. When you said fans, I was going, the fanatics, they're all there. And then keeping it really cool, which means, the little fog on the being nicely displayed before they come out and do their performance.
Yeah.
But thinking about that and thinking of maybe a little, what do we call it, a philosophical mic drop moment, I just want to kind of talk through the intellectual property angle to this as well, because we've got quantum algorithms will invent something new. So there's a question of who owns it. It's the person who coded it. It's the company that funded it. It's the machine that gets first rights to the royalties. Like I said, is it the machine that gets the book deal and they just tell ChatGPT to cease and desist, and they just talk amongst themselves somehow? What is your take on this? And would you draw any comparisons with what we're dealing with in the AI space? Would that help?
Yeah, so I think you're right. So there's two issues with IP to do with quantum computing. There's IP relating to the quantum technology itself and how you protect that. As you say, some of it might be code. There's obviously much wider discussions about, owning IP and code and things like that. So that's one concern people might need to grapple with. And the point Rory you're making, which I think is an interesting one, is a generated work. Something we haven't really talked about is quantum AI, which is essentially AI, which is powered by quantum computing. And essentially that just means it's super...
Just for everybody who just started groaning straight away, we're going, there's another terminology. We had responsible AI, explainable AI, auditable AI. Now we've got quantum AI.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just recognizing for everybody else who's listening and going, oh, another one I'm going to have to learn about. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Please continue.
This one, I would say, in the context of quantum technologies, is a slightly easier one because all you need to remember is it's AI powered by quantum. So, at least it's one that we can understand a bit better than some of the other ones. But I think what that means, where you're right, I think looking at how AI develops, how the area of law develops around that, I think will answer a lot of the questions we have around quantum. Because going back to how we described quantum computing at the beginning, the two big benefits are speed. Okay. So in a way, that doesn't really change the IP considerations. It just makes it faster. I think what is interesting is this point about it answering questions that classic computers can't. And you used, I think, a good example earlier of, for example, things in genetics, for example, like the quantum computers could be really good at helping us with that. And I think for those listening, trying to understand why the machine I've described would help with that, the best example I've heard, and maybe it's another analogy, so sometimes that doesn't help people, is it would be like giving an artist saying, paint the Mona Lisa, and giving them a load of matchsticks. It just would never look like the Mona Lisa if they don't have a paintbrush. And the quantum computer just mimics the natural world better. It's more like the equivalent of a paintbrush than matchsticks. And I think that will be the interesting area where a quantum generated, let's say, drug, for example, will be more unique than just the fact it has sped up the discovery of the drug, for example, which will be the first use case. And I think in that, then you're looking at the principles we're dealing with at the moment with AI generated works. What are we trying to protect? Who is an inventor? All those kind of questions. But I think that's one area where there'll be a lot of overlap between AI and quantum technologies.
Good, because anything that we can draw on without having to reinvent the law is music to any in-house lawyer's ears, because we don't have time to sit around and ponder these philosophical questions sometimes. But let's zoom out a little bit more from this. So what I've seen is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen that we've got the UK's quantum strategy, which talks about building a quantum literate workforce. And then you're embedding quantum into national infrastructure, as you mentioned, the Act. Then you've got the EU's quantum flagship, which is pushing quantum valley, as it's described, across Europe. Where does the legal profession fit into all these visions? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think let's take in-house, for example, rather than me in disputes who just waits for somebody to
wait for us to get it wrong. I get it. That definition we chose wrong. Okay, get it.
Plus 6 years and then you meet me. But let's think about that. Like, how does this all fit in? I think this isn't a form of technology that people are going to be interacting with day to day in the same way that we do with AI. But I think it will be something that will be part of the portfolio of what people are going to be thinking about. So let's say someone's in-house and they work in, let's say, a pharmaceutical company. They're going to be dealing with this a lot more than somebody who works maybe, in the legal department at a university, for example, where there might be a little bit of use of quantum technologies, but not in the same way. So I think the role of lawyers at the moment, I think, is probably more connected with things around cyber, to be honest, to think about things from that perspective and how that risk is being met. And then I think in the kind of the more, near but longer term future, lawyers are just going to have to be thinking about, obviously, if there's any kind of acquisition of quantum technologies, how that fits in with the national security framework, which might have changed a little bit, but probably will still exist. And thinking about things, for example, like from an IP perspective as well, if they're kind of developing their own quantum technologies. And so that's, I think, where I think lawyers are going to be really dealing with things more in the day-to-day, rather than AI, which I think, you have these freely accessible models that kind of causes its own issues, for example, for lawyers.
I agree in that.
Yeah, it's a little bit more ubiquitous. So I think thinking about it more as kind of one of those elite forms of technology that you're going to be using as part of your business and the questions that come from that.
I think it's what drew me to kind of a few thoughts is around right now. If you haven't already, there's a lot of lawyers creating their AI policies for their companies. Some of those policies are actually being written by the HR teams rather than the legal teams. And sometimes the introduction of AI in the countering cyber threats as well, from certain threat actors that are, from your ransomware attacks to denial of service attacks, etc. You've got all of these pushing through by the CISO, through the ISO CTO, through the HR directors, and legal sometimes, and I'm talking to those in very small legal teams rather than the big powerhouse legal teams that can pretty much run like a law firm. They're trying to step into those conversations by bringing the angle from the legal perspective. And I find that this, for some people I just talk to, they've struggled with getting their voice heard. But everything that you're talking about here it has connotations to what we're doing with an AI, as to any kind of new technology that's brought into a company to ensure that we have the right compliance parameters, so that we're still in line with GDPR, we're still in line with our obligations to other clients. Like, they dictate where our policies need to be sometimes, because your biggest client might be saying, I need you to have this certification. And people just think that's not a legal question. Why would we involve legal? I find it fascinating, but I think if we're going to predict where the profession needs to be when it comes to, I'm going to say it, quantum AI, Rebecca's coined now. If she coined the word, she's coined the word for this podcast. So quantum AI comes through. I think it's for us in-house team, subject to obviously finding the time to do it, but it is kind of hopeful that we will be able to embed ourselves within all of those teams now in some shape or form, in order to ensure that when this technology comes into play, that we're already there, setting the right tone, the right marks, and asking the right questions, rather than making assumptions and being led by others. We're actually there ourselves in those conversations where we need to be. It's not easy to do, I know. And for some listening, they're still knocking on that door to get in. But it just feels like this is another reason for us to be at those tables. So anyway, I'll jump down off my soapbox now, and we'll go back to Rebecca now, because Rebecca's going, I'm a barrister.
No, but I think
deal with these things.
But I think you're right, Rory. And I think one thing where probably that role is particularly important is, I think, twofold. One, anytime I talk to technical people, they just don't know that there is any law to do with this, for example. So it's kind of making people aware that there actually is, there are some legal frameworks already in place. And secondly, just that patchwork of legal frameworks and how it's going to interact. I think that's where legal can really offer help to the business in terms of understanding the intersection of these legal points with what people are practically trying to do. And
okay, so, you just put it better than I did. So everybody just ignore what I just said and just go with what Rebecca said. That's all great. Thank you very much. Okay. I wanted to kind of take a look at something which is about Rebecca yourself, because we're talking about all your stuff that you've been doing. And as an Irish person like myself, we don't like talking about ourselves at all. But I do want to ask you two questions. One is, what's one thing about your work that people always get wrong?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, well, it's probably just people think I wear a wig and gown all the time and walk around, which just isn't true. I'd say I've worn the wig and gown a couple of times, not the times you would expect. Usually it's actually can be in quite a low court. The Supreme Court never wig and gown. So you might end up seeing me in a wig and gown when I'm at a relatively unimportant case. So that's usually, people think I just sit in this room.
We should judge every barrister who's in a wig and gown means they're not doing anything really important.
Absolutely, where I'd say
right,
just
good.
imagine they're walking around, they're not even going to court. They're just doing it for photographs.
Oh, that's interesting. But then what's one thing that's fun about your work?
I like that I get to meet a lot of people. So I know we joked, Rory, at the beginning that people see me, 6 years after a mistake, basically, which I understand why the joke is made. But actually, a lot of the time, I feel like it's fun and it's a privilege to get to meet people when it might be a bit of a difficult time professionally. They're trying to deal maybe with the fallout of something. You also get to learn a lot about their day-to-day work, what they do, the organization they work for. And I think that's quite fun. So I feel like I appear, for some probably as a nightmare, I hope as a dream for others, for a short period of time, and then learn a little bit about their life and then let them go on their way. And I find that quite fun.
That's good. No, thank you for sharing that. That's great. Okay, so I want to just give you a big thanks to you, Rebecca Keating, for helping us decode the future before it decodes us. And for everybody listening, if you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, maybe forward to one of your colleagues who still thinks quantum is a Bond villain. So until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and always read the fine print. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rory.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Fine Print. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss the next episode. And if you have any burning questions you want us to cover in a future episode, send them to beyondthefineprint@rmoklegal.com. See you next time.